Recently, I've been playing a lot of Crypt of the Necrodancer, and it got me thinking about how games choose to implement difficulty. There are a handful of characters in Crypt, each with their own unique style of gameplay. Items and stat upgrades are unlocked as you play, so the game tends to get easier over time. Finally, each level's pacing is dictated by the soundtrack, so increasing the tempo of a level's music means that you move faster, and so do all the monsters. These are just three of the ways that game designers can create challenge, and there are endless methods for bringing the right amount of difficulty to complement a game's mechanics. Although difficulty is sometimes an afterthought when considering the player experience, it tends to be a daunting matter. Recall that in our last Longform, we discussed how randomness can have wide-reaching effects, so using it incorrectly can destroy even the best game design. In a similar way, difficulty is the key catalyst behind flow, the player state that every developer strives to deliver with their game. It's troubling that difficulty has such a large effect on the end product, because difficulty can be one of the toughest aspects of a game to manage. If you offer only a single level of challenge, the game must be balanced around that point, but you might discourage players whose skill is not within the bell curve. If you offer 2 or 5 or 100 levels of challenge, then the game must be balanced 2 or 5 or 100 different ways, and you've got to spend time adjusting your game to as many different skill levels as you choose. In this analysis, we'll take a look at difficulty as it pertains to the player experience. We'll first try to nail down a good definition of the concept, then explore some of the ways that it can be implemented in a game, regardless of genre. Finally, we'll get into the psychology of game difficulty, and what difficulty means as a silent conversation between developer and player. Because this is such a deep topic, we'll divide up this analysis into two separate videos. The first part will delve into setting up our framework and ideas for game difficulty. The second part will complete our framework and demonstrate practical applications. I think we already have a pretty good sense of what difficulty means in the context of a video game, but I want to set a broad definition here that we can use. The word difficulty itself actually means something not easily done, accomplished, or comprehended, but in gaming it's often used to refer to the wide spectrum of all possible challenge options. That is, difficulty in gaming doesn't mean difficult, it means easy, normal, hard, or any variation within. It's best thought of as a synonym of challenge. The difficulty of Cookie Clicker? Very easy. The difficulty of Dark Souls? Very challenging. With this definition, we can examine the relative difficulty options in a single game, or compare relative difficulties between two entirely different games. Difficulty is tough to balance, and frequently it's an afterthought in most game design. In other words, the levels and tasks are fleshed out before the nitty-gritty of how much damage this enemy does, or how much experience that monster gives. Difficulty can be as volatile as a bomb, because poor difficulty balance can easily destroy a beautiful game and undermine all of your hard work. If you're designing an RPG, you work on each area first, creating characters and cutscenes to explore a story. The actual numbers and mechanics can be tweaked once you've gotten the core gameplay down. But if 50% of all players' parties wipe in the game's first encounter, you're going to turn off a lot of potential players and stifle word-of-mouth promotion. In this way, you're appealing to a niche market, while your game's promotion appeals to a much larger one. Have you ever seen a film trailer that was strikingly dissimilar to the actual film? This is just one result of the dissonance that poor difficulty can create in a game. If the goal of any game is to resonate somehow within the player, then difficulty can be the fine-tuning or the hacksaw that can cripple that resonance. Most games actively work to induce flow, which is a tightrope walk between difficulty and player skill. We can consider these two aspects of game design to be metagame or emergent properties, meaning that they are born from interactions among basic gameplay concepts. Tetris isn't challenging simply because there are blocks. It's because there are many different block shapes, a limited field of play, and a timer that forces you to make moves quickly. A player that can manage all three is skilled enough to advance on to a more difficult stage, where the challenge is increased further to try and maintain flow. To induce flow, the player progression should be as close as possible to the progression in difficulty, and since a game designer can't change player skill, they're forced to change difficulty to reveal the exact nature of the skill and challenge relationship. If a slight bump in difficulty requires a disproportionate increase in player skill, the game is too hard and flow is interrupted. Instead of the smooth curve or step function that we want, we'll find that we have something that wavers outside of the desired boundaries. While all players will become more skilled over time, not all players will do so at the same rate. What's more is that the proportionality between these two concepts changes at a different rate for every game, perhaps even in different markets. As a designer, this means that you're trying to broadly induce flow by tinkering with individual game mechanics to improve the results in a cohesive system of mechanics. It's a bit like a mathematical function. The only way to tell what the output will be is to tweak the input a little bit, run it through your system, and see what's popped out on the other side. We'll talk about this proportionality between challenge and skill shortly, but keep it in mind as the underlying goal when addressing game difficulty. There are 1,000,001 ways to implement difficulty, and even more ways to balance it. We'll try to stick to the major methods that have persisted in the industry to showcase the big ideas. As far as I know, a widely accepted construct for game difficulty has yet to be created, so everything I'm putting forth here is my own personal way to organize game difficulty. That being said, the way we'll categorize here is not only subjective, but probably inefficient, so if you have any thoughts on a more effective way to examine difficulty, be sure to let us know. Our very first task should be to divide difficulty into two broad categories, mechanical difficulty and conceptual difficulty. In each of these categories, we're now dealing with intended and unintended, as well as the many subsets of each. We'll see that most forms of difficulty can be grouped into one of these four categories, and while the differences between each type are fairly discrete, that line will begin to blur as we get into the details. Joe, the other half of Game Soup, made an excellent suggestion, so we'll further divide examples between rewarding and frustrating, and because any pseudo-academic discussion should try to remain objective, we'll adopt the term incremental for frustrating and decremental for rewarding to further describe our difficulty. Intended mechanical difficulty accounts for the vast majority of all instances of a challenge in a game. It's mechanical because the challenge is based in manipulating confined game mechanics accessible to the player. Broadly speaking, it often takes the form of anything you see on screen that responds to controller input. For example, something as simple as programming the movement in the very first Super Mario Bros. Is a form of adjusting the game's intended mechanical difficulty. Have you ever noticed that Mario has both a speed up and a slow down period each time he walks or runs? It feels natural in this game because it's been matched to the level design. But if you made Mario's acceleration only a fifth of what he normally has, it would take you that much longer to get to full running speed. Suddenly, large jumps are difficult because you didn't have the platform space from a dead stop. In fact, the trope of making an ice level where you slip and slide all over the ground is simply a manipulation of player acceleration and movement. At the other end of this extreme, we can set acceleration arbitrarily high, and Mario will instantly be at full speed when moving and instantly stop without a gradual change in between. While this may feel more abrupt, it's the factor responsible for creating tight controls, and most of the time we'd much prefer utilitarian controls to ultra-realistic controls. But most games aren't designed to incorporate this awkward abruptness, and as a result, they have varying levels of player acceleration, player speed, player density, gravity, and many other factors. And remember earlier when we said that poor difficulty balance can be the hacksaw that undermines the experience? Ice physics in a level designed with bottomless pits could prove to be a disaster for the average player by using intentional incremental difficulty. So it's important to balance player animations and movement around the desired challenge. How about Super Mario Bros. 2? Luigi had a much floatier jump than Mario, and the added benefit of being able to cross long gaps and correct your trajectory when the platforming gets tricky. A change as simple as adjusting the game's gravity can massively decrement the mechanical challenge of the platforming, giving you more time to react. This exemplifies the unique character gameplay styles that we mentioned above regarding Crypt of the Necrodancer, and this method is an industry staple in many RPGs and action games. Modifying game physics is the basis for most 2D fighting titles. In Smash Bros., it's what makes Bowser a big, slow fighter, but Pit a fast, floaty one. Consider the difficulty of Flappy Bird. The real fight here is actually against the gravity that's programmed into the game, which is nothing more than a single value that can be easily tweaked by a developer. Of course, gravity is usually just another form of acceleration, just in the up and down directions. If the blocks in Angry Birds had the density of a black hole, you'd have a real tough time trying to knock them down by shooting an animal out of a cannon. This all ties back to how individual characters are programmed to mimic reality, at least in part. We notice if acceleration is way off, and we notice if our character stops instantly from a full run. Player movement itself can lead to unique implementations of difficulty. Even a very narrow platform would pose no challenge to a character with no acceleration period, but it could be a tear your hair out challenge if the character was designed to slip and slide all the time. If movement is designed after the levels, then the movement can be easily adjusted and fine-tuned without having to change the core design of your game. In truth, games of all genres rely on intended mechanical difficulty to provide challenge. Guitar Hero and Rock Band can both be difficult games that operate on a singular gameplay element. It's not hard to hold a button with one hand and strum with the other, but it's undeniably hard to do this hundreds or thousands of times in just a few minutes at varying speeds and rhythms, while you can only sight read a few notes into the future. Challenge also comes from player animations. Performing a jump attack in Dark Souls locks your character in the attack animation, and during this time, you can't move or cancel the attack in any way. This means you've got to think carefully about when to use this attack, because even though it's powerful, you're exposing yourself to danger due to the very long animation lock. Heavier weapons tend to be more powerful as well, but you're leaving yourself open for a long period of time as a result. This mechanical difficulty makes up a core component of the game, dictating the flow of combat when a single strike could mean failure. A similar animation lock occurs in Castlevania for the NES. Once you jump, your left-right momentum is conserved, and you have no control whatsoever over your character for the duration of the jump. Furthermore, any damage you take locks your character in a knockback animation. This can make platforming a nightmare, even though it is technically accurate physics. Most games do allow your character some movement in the air, because even though it's less accurate, it usually makes the game feel more fair. In other words, it lowers the challenge very slightly, because you can correct yourself in midair, but because of the change, we can now up the ante on our game's platforming and expect more out of the player in turn. As silly as it sounds, this makes for a better jumping experience than when your animation is locked. So challenge can occur via the duration of animations, or the options not accessible to the player in certain situations. Invincibility frames after taking damage mechanically adjust the difficulty by preventing repeated unavoidable damage. Anytime you play Street Fighter and miss your opponent with a heavy attack, you're leaving yourself open for the duration of your character's animation. But even if you get hit, your invincibility frames might keep you alive. Showing the player that strength has a trade-off in the form of time does a great job of reinforcing specific player behaviors, because taking control away from a player leaves them helpless and vulnerable for the duration. This is sometimes used as a cheap way to include artificial difficulty in games. Artificial difficulty can occur in any of our 4 major categories, such as mechanically intended stun locking. Our Castlevania example above shows artificial difficulty because of the player physics clashing with the level design. In a real-time game, taking control away from the player for even a second can mean the difference between life and death. And because this death wasn't based on the player's skill in real time, it has the potential to feel cheap. The game is reminding you that you need to play by its rules. But if the words unfair death come to mind, then there was probably a better way for the developers to give you this reminder. When a game's difficulty is at least partially situational, then difficulty as a whole can be adjusted without making any major changes to enemy or player behavior. This is the logic behind checkpoint systems. The current challenge level is probably only temporary, so saving time getting the player back to that section helps reduce the difficulty. Compare this with forcing the player to start from the beginning of the level every time he or she dies. To achieve this goal, Resident Evil 4 features automatic enemy density adjustments, depending on the number of times a player has died in an area. The more recent Mario titles allow you to bypass difficult sections of a level if you lose a certain number of lives. These intended mechanical techniques greatly increase the skill range of your player base. If you can handle 2 enemies at once but not 4, then simply reducing the number of simultaneous threats can achieve the same goal as playing with numbers on the back end. Why balance an alternative set of statistics to make a zombie's attack deal 50% damage, when instead, you could just cut the number of zombies by 50%? The latter, if not objectively better, is definitely more time efficient, and for complex games with a lot of numbers, time is something that developers don't really have a lot of. There are also many genre-specific tricks to adjusting a game's base challenge. If your character in XCOM only has a 60% chance to hit with his gun, then perhaps lowering the difficulty would adjust the randomness to increase the odds of a successful shot. Games with roguelike elements sometimes forgo difficulty toggling and instead provide long-term upgrades that carry over to each restart, like Rogue Legacy. If your 2D platformer has certain levels that feature an automatically scrolling camera, then the speed of that scrolling camera is a form of difficulty itself, and it's independent of enemy AI or player animation. The faster the scroll, the harder the level is to complete. RPGs frequently use a leveling system that's just a numbers game, and if you overlevel your characters, the game will become easy. But if an RPG nearly requires the player to grind for hours between each story arc, it's prolonging the game experience by inflating difficulty. Since the leveling mechanic is built into both playable characters and enemies, developers are free to adjust enemy difficulty by changing their strength, speed, defense, or any other property. The player's skill during a random battle would ideally be the most important factor in victory, but even the most skilled player can't win against a boss that's 90 levels higher than they are. I'm not implying the developers who do this are lazy by any means. They've chosen this method to implement difficulty, and whether it's a good or bad choice depends solely on the context of the individual game. Unintended mechanical difficulty can sometimes show itself through unbalanced abilities. These might warrant a buff or a nerf. Whenever the complexity of game mechanics leads to unintended behavior, there is the potential for exploiting imbalances, which necessitates increasing or decreasing player abilities when games are symmetrically competitive, like StarCraft or Halo. Wherever you see a buff or a nerf, you can be fairly certain that there was once an unintended mechanical difficulty, whether incremental or decremental, related to that skill or ability. Hearthstone occasionally nerfs and buffs certain cards, because the unpredictable metagame is constantly promoting unique deck combinations that may upset the balance of power between the game's 9 classes. The other, and much more prevalent arm of unintended mechanical difficulty is mostly within the realm of the hardware, both in technological limitations and in programming errors. Have you ever had to fight a game's camera and lost? Many games in the early years of 3D had notably contrarian camera systems, which ideally shouldn't ever cause the player to lose. But because the camera is now an additional element to fine-tune, the developer's vision must account for its behavior in all cases. Falling into a bottomless pit because the camera suddenly swivels 360 degrees looks bad and feels worse, and no developer intends for this to happen. Technical limitations that affect difficulty might be things like pop-up, unclear orientation, or low draw distance. If Skyrim only had a draw distance of 3 feet, it would be a lot harder to avoid enemy attacks. Or if quest items popped in only when you got within 5 feet of them, you could spend hours searching an area for an item you've already walked past 4 times. Sure, these limitations are an annoyance, but they tend to maintain the integrity of the game experience, which is in stark contrast with our next point: bugs and glitches, which I consider to be the most virulent strain of programming error. Unlike our technological limitation examples, bugs and glitches arise from human error. For example, in Mario RPG, you can skip a major early boss fight by jumping over the trigger for it. Exploits like this that give advantages to a player artificially increase player skill relative to the current challenge level, which means a temporary decrease in difficulty. Most RPGs are built to resist this form of leveling up. It doesn't make sense to bypass a fight if you're going to be under-leveled later as a result. Any game with a reproducible mechanical bug has the potential for its difficulty to be unintentionally altered. Every game, whether a weekend project or a AAA masterpiece, will have bugs and glitches. Sometimes they can totally break the game experience and make it unbeatable. Bubble Bobble Revolution for the DS had 100 levels, but the boss of level 30 didn't spawn, meaning that anyone who bought a copy was stuck at that point. Other times, bugs and glitches allow you to skip whole chunks of a game and get a faster completion time, making those games popular for speedrunning. In Super Mario 64, you can start a new file, fight Bowser, and see the end credits in under 10 minutes, if you use a glitch called the backwards long jump glitch. Many Metroidvania titles are speedrun favorites because of sequence breaking, using glitches to bypass the intended player progression, leading to incredibly fast completion. To relate all this back to Crypt of the Necrodancer, we can see that there are still difficulty methods that have yet to be fully explored. Easy, medium, and hard mode are replaced with a static level difficulty, but dynamic character difficulty. Playing as a different character is the main way the player chooses a difficulty setting. But what about increasing the tempo of a level's music? If the gameplay is directly tied to that tempo, then making the music faster would make the gameplay harder, even if the dungeon layout and the enemies remain the same. Like a scrolling camera, this increases difficulty by requiring faster player input. It doesn't matter how much you plan or strategize beforehand. The game is hard because you think on your feet at 160 beats per minute, and learning to quickly assess your surroundings with so little time to plan beforehand makes it a difficult but addicting experience. As a result, most player deaths are the fault of the player. Cheap and unfair deaths in this game are rare. Enemies feature no random pathing or random attacks, so you're never rolling dice to know if you're about to die. A skeleton that's 2 steps away from you will always jump 1 space towards you if possible, and if it kills you, it's because you moved into a converging tile. We're getting into the topic of fairness here, so to stay on track, we'll save the majority of that discussion for later on. We've now covered our first major category, mechanical difficulty. The other fork, conceptual difficulty, will have to wait until part 2. In the meantime, we thank you for your ongoing support of Game Soup.